हाँ डाल। हेलो हाँ बोलिए।
कौन सा वाला मैडम?
हाँ सर बोले।
कौन सा वाला?
बस
आर्किटेक्चर लेक्चर। कॉपी कर दूँ मैडम?
कॉपी कर लो। तुमने खोल के रख दी क्या स्टोरी ऑफ सर? हाँ तो अब मतलब इसको यहाँ पर वो कर देंगे ना, साइड में खोल के रख देंगे। क्यों तुम्हारा वो स्क्रीन कैसे ऑफ होती है?
कौन सा वाला?
प्रीव्यू लेआउट से।
इनकी वो वाली बंद करनी है ना?
हाँ
एक सेकंड ऑफ का ऑप्शन।
इसमें कहाँ से होती
नहीं इसमें नहीं,
स्टॉप नहीं होती?
फ्रीज हो जाएगी।
हाँ फ्रीज हो जाएगी ना, वही तो।
देखिए फ्रीज की ये ऑप्शन जैसे करेंगे ना तो वो फ्रीज हो जाएगा उसका जो चल रहा है केवल।
दैट इज़ व्हाट। जैसे अभी ये फ्रीज कर दिया, उधर नहीं आएगा।
आप चूज करेंगे वो नहीं आएगा। अब यही दिखेगा केवल, और कुछ नहीं। अब
यार
अभी तो दिखेगा। अभी फ्रीज का ही किया, अभी फ्रीज किया नहीं किया क्या?
हुआ नहीं
अभी
दबाया तो था।
दबाया अभी
उधर थोड़ी इधर दबाओगे ना?
नहीं
वहाँ दबाओगे।
हाँ प्रोजेक्टर फ्रीज कर देगा। जैसे कि अभी ये कर दिया फ्रीज कर देगा ऑप्शन।
ओके हाँ ठीक है, लिखा आ रहा है।
अब आप करेंगे इसको ओपन करिए।
आयुषी इंट्रोडक्शन देख लिया ना?
सर एक बार प्रॉब्लम है अपने में। पहले क्या होता था, इस बहुत बड़ी प्रॉब्लम हो गई। आ रहा है ना वो नीचे रह रहा है। अभी रिकॉर्डिंग चालू चालू करें रिकॉर्ड।
क्या हुआ? बंद कर दिया क्या?
नहीं मैडम, चलिए यस करो। यस
क्यों आया पर ये ऐसे?
मैडम अपडेट
क्यों हो रहा है?
मैडम वो अपडेट आ रहे हैं
तो उसमें आएगा?
नहीं आएगा, नहीं आएगा, चालू है फिर। कहाँ है सर?
पता नहीं। इनका क्या करेंगे तो ये मॉनिटर चेंज करवा दें।
अच्छा
इनकी क्या रेजोल्यूशन ज़्यादा वाले।
अच्छा
तो अपन क्या पुराने वाले रखा।
तो पहले कैसे आता था?
HP वाले
पहले कैसे आता था?
बेसिकली क्या हुआ है, जब अपन ने रीसेट किए हैं एक बार दो बार, तो इनकी रेजोल्यूशन सबका रीसेट हो गया। मैंने वहाँ पे करवाया।
अच्छा
कॉन्फ्रेंस वाला अभी जो लड़का आया था उससे करवाया था कि ऐसा हो रहा है। तो उसने किया था कि रेजोल्यूशन चेंज इसमें नहीं कर सकते, मॉनिटर का जो रेजोल्यूशन है उसको लो अलर्ट करेंगे।
तो वो बहुत बड़ी परेशानी आती है व्यापार से। हाँ तो उठ के जाना पड़ता है।
नहीं वहाँ पर दो काम होने चाहिए। अब शर्मा जी
बहुत परेशानी है वो तो, एक तो उठ के चेंज करने जाओ और चेंज करना होता है।
इसकी चालू कर दो तो अपने आप उतर
कहते तो रिकॉर्डिंग चालू कर अभी तो चालू हो जाए, इसकी रिकॉर्डिंग चालू कर दे, ये चलता रहेगा फिर। आरुषि कितने बजे से चालू होगा? अरे यार मैंने तो उसका स्लीपिंग टाइम चेंज कर दिया
तो यूट्यूब में तब तक लोड हो जाएगा।
एक सेकंड कर देता हूँ। उसका टाइम तो चेंज कर दिया था मैंने, फिर क्या आ रहा है? सेव चेंज फिर स्लीपिंग में हो जा रहा है। अच्छा रीस्टार्ट करना पड़ेगा, एक बार तब आएगा। चलो छोड़ो, कोई दिक्कत नहीं। बता दो क्या करना है।
हाँ यूट्यूब
बोलो।
स्टोरी ऑफ स्टफ।
स्टॉप स्टाफ।
हाँ STUFF।
कौन सा वाला? ये वाला?
हाँ ऊपर और दोनों आप लोड करके रख लीजिए।
दोनों लोड कर
हाँ,
डाउनलोड कर दें। डाउनलोड नहीं होगा, चलाना पड़ेगा यूट्यूब से, डायरेक्ट चलाना पड़ेगा, प्ले करना पड़ेगा।
नेट आ जाएगा, बफर तो नहीं होगा?
कोई दिखाए तो आपको चल रहा है ना। चाहो तो पॉज करके रख लो, जब
हाँ वही
तो
पॉज
चला
करके रख लीजिए, तो वो पूरा हो जाएगा लोड।
चला देना।
ठीक।
मुझे जाना है।
Hello, ma'am.
Yeah, it's loaded.
I should start.
Yeah, good morning everyone. I welcome you all for the seminar on sustainability in built environment. Sustainability in built environment is a huge field to cover and includes all the global initiatives from local perspectives basically. Let me introduce you the term sustainability in built environment. Sustainability in built environment is about the building science which covers parameters like thermal comfort, solar passive architecture, design and energy efficiency. It's an assessment regarding the different audits comparison with international and national rating systems like ASHRAE, LEED, IGBC and GRIHA, and understanding those concepts and relating to it our building context. It's the ecological footprint life cycle analysis which creates roadmap to follow the future steps. There are different models of eco-village sustainability housing which have similar grounds and concepts regarding to it. So, sustainability is an approach which not only includes implementation or execution of policies, but the behavioral approach to plan our future. It's a seriousness which is required to achieve sustainability. Well, this could be better explained by our guest today, Dr. Usha Iyer ma'am. She is Associate Professor and Duty Head at School of Property and Construction Management, RMIT, University.Melbourne, Australia. Please welcome Dr. Usha ma'am for her gracious presence. Yeah. Please come.
इसको ऊपर रखा.
हाँ मैम सही कहा. स्क्रीन मैडम ये स्क्रीन ऊपर नहीं होगा, यही चलेगा ये मॉनिटर. पॉइंटर मैडम यहाँ पे पॉइंटर आना पड़ेगा, नीचे रखा है.
नहीं कोई ज़रूरत नहीं है. I can just use this, na?
Yes.
Okay.
Good afternoon everyone, and thank you for spending a bit of your Saturday holiday with me. I hope you'll find it an interesting session. I know Ayushi, she spent the last 12 days with me, and as well as Anjali here, and we had a lot of fun. So I hope whatever we talk about today, you use it as an opportunity to learn a little bit, of course, but also strategies to help you apply some of the things that I'm going to be talking about. So when Anjali asked me to talk to you today, and of course I agreed, The question that was asked is, you know, who are the students? Because I need to know my audience before I start thinking about boring my audience, right? So maximum boredom or minimum boredom. So she told me that you're all architecture students. So I thought I'll just focus a little bit more on the buildings and the built environment side of it. There's a lot to talk about, but I have condensed it all. I'm going to go through some of these things very quickly. But if you want me to elaborate on something, this is we're very informal in Australia. So if you want me to elaborate on something, you want me to stop somewhere, you have a question to ask, put your hand up and we can stop there and we can discuss in more detail. So what I'm going to cover, I thought it would be really useful, and again, you know, with some feedback that I got from my students over the last 12 days, I thought it would be useful to give you a very global perspective on what is happening around the world as far as sustainability is concerned, and Ayushi has already expressed it in her own words. Thank you, Ayushi. So I'll talk a little bit about what's happening at a global context, and then I'll talk a little bit about what's happening in India, and what does sustainability actually mean, and what it may mean to you, and that's for you to discover. That's your part of your journey through life. And then I'll give you some examples of how sustainability can be seen to be applied in buildings and the built environment. So I hope that's okay. So let's see what is going on. So actually, and I'll show this on the next slide, which I haven't shown here. But since the early to late 90s, there has been a renewed global attention towards the fact that we have just the one planet, and that we are not looking after this one planet because we need to rely on this one planet for our resources. The very act of building and construction requires us to use things from the earth. We need to use, for example, mud to make bricks or clay to make bricks. We need to mine materials from the earth. So I will take you through that process. But coming back to this, there has been this renewed attention for a number of reasons. One, because of the recognition that we have a finite planet and we are not giving back to the earth what we are taking from the earth. So that's one thing. But there's also now a sense of inequity across different parts of the world. So there are certain parts of the globe that are using resources at an unprecedented scale and not leaving enough for other parts of the world to be doing that. So for example, the United Arab Emirates has got one of the largest footprints, what we call footprint, the amount of land area that people, an average United Arab Emirate citizen or person living there needs to use compared to someone who's living in India or in Africa. And we went through that exercise over the last 12 days. So this global attention has come largely driven by United Nations, but also driven by a number of other governments worldwide. Just to sort of highlight some of the key things that have happened, for example, the Kyoto Protocol that came into 1997, the Stern Review in 2007 focused the attention more from purely looking at environmental issues, which previously we have tended to focus upon, but also to start talking about the economics of climate change, talking about the economics and the fact that, you know, you can decouple economic growth from environmental degradation. So the two are not necessarily a causal relationship. So you can continue to have economic growth without degrading the environment. And there are principles and practices that we can use to help support that. And I'll touch upon a few of those. So you can see since 2000, and particularly from 2007, a lot has happened very quickly. But the fact remains that we have still not come to a unified consensus globally about what is the share of every human citizen that every human citizen on this world needs to take. In theory, perhaps, but not in practice. And of course, it's not just a case of, you know, what individual person needs or wants, because needs are different from wants. You know, some needs are about basic necessities, but wants go far beyond that. So there are all these discussions that are taking place, which are not just looking at the environment, but also looking at things from, and as I said, with stern review on the economics of sustainability and climate change, we are now talking increasingly about the social side of sustainability, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So a number of different conferences, I won't go through each and every one, but the latest one that now a lot of countries are responding is the Paris Agreement that was in 2015, and that sort of renewed particularly the built environment. There was a Buildings Day that was launched in COP21 in Paris, and then there was a Paris Agreement that a number of countries signed to. 198 countries signed to, a few haven't, and I think the foremost or perhaps the most infamous one is the US, who signed the Paris Agreement when Obama was the president, and then pulled out when Trump became the president. But regardless of that, individual jurisdictions in the US, different states in the US, there are 50 states in the US, and a number of these states said, regardless of central support or presidential leadership as far as sustainability and climate change is concerned, we will still continue to respond. And so a number of different states have brought in regulations at a number of different levels, ranging from net zero energy emissions to looking at practices of supporting and behavioral change towards sustainability. So the next one, the next COP, which is 21, 22, 23, is going to take place this year in Poland. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. And as part of this annual meeting now, these Conference of Parties, COP's Conference of Parties, and they're a UN-led consortium looking at sustainability and climate change. And as part of this, we are now reporting against the Paris Agreement. So there's now pressure for not just signing up or ratifying agreements, but also now asking individual countries, the onus on individual countries to show what they're doing in relation to climate change and sustainability. So the reason I have shown this is to sort of track back to what happened in 1987, which is where, and probably most of you weren't even born then, but in the 70s, in the early 70s, there was an oil embargo. So there was again politically driven largely, but a recognition that the center of where oil comes in currently in the world is largely from the Arab states, and a recognition that these Arab states are not going to pump out oil ad infinitum into the future. This is going to run out at some stage. And so when this politically driven oil embargo came into existence, there was a recognition that we need to start thinking about ways in which we can continue to live on this planet with little or no oil. And so efforts towards energy conservation started, a recognition that we need to be careful with what we use. And so a number of discussions at that point took place at a worldwide scale, and that's what led to this book called Our Common Future. And that was driven largely by the Prime Minister of Netherlands at that time, Gro Harlem Brundtland, and then came to be known as the Brundtland Report, and there's a definition which I'll talk about later on of sustainability as well. So that was at that time the energy conservation ideas started, and then was the Rio Summit in 1992, where Rio is in South America, and this Rio Summit focused at that time on, and the popular 3 R's became very part of, as people reduce, reuse, recycle. But what was important about the Rio Summit was that there was no longer that recognition that things are going to happen only at a global scale, wherein countries would get involved in these discussions. There are lots of things that local people can do, and so that led to the rise of something called Agenda 21. There were 21 principles that were set out as part of Agenda 21 that came out of the Rio Summit, where a number of local municipalities, local councils signed up to. So from a movement that was almost exclusively driven top-down, there was an opportunity for some bottom-up interaction, ground-level swelling that took place as well, and how do we do this? And of course, needless to say, you know, both are important. The top-down is important because you need to drive leadership to do this, but that does not mean that that leadership is the only momentum that can be built to drive sustainability and climate change. You can also build it from bottom-up momentum. And there are lots of examples in India. For example, the Chipko movement is very much a bottom-up movement that has then brought attention of local authorities to do something about it. So both the top-down as well as the bottom-up are equally important. In 2002, 10 years on, we had a recognition that you know, time is moving on, and a clear, and the number of IPCC reports, Intergovernmental Planet on Climate Change, number of these reports that started looking at the state of the world and the state of what is going to happen to the earth in 50, 100, 200 years and so on. And again, a clear recognition that we are now moving into a path of no return as far as climate change is concerned, and increasingly moving towards hotter climates, drier climates, frequent storm surges, you know, flooding, extreme weather events, and that we need to be prepared. So you can try and imagine what all this means for the built environment. So if we are going to have hotter days, we are going to need to start thinking about more shading, for example, the sorts of materials that we use to try and drive more cross ventilation into our buildings. If we move into more wetter climates where there's more frequent flooding, then we need to start thinking about where we build and how we build, and whether there's enough availability on the site or within that precinct to be able to discharge that water, which is going to come at a much faster and at a much higher rate. And if we are going to start looking at storm surges, then what happens when we build around the coastal areas, and how do we prevent that inland flooding from happening? So these are all the sorts of things that, you know, as people involved in the built environment, you're going to need to think about, and these are some of the challenges that you're going to face. Now already there are signs that this is going to be a very hot summer in India. Already signs that Gwalior is running out of water. And today's paper, I found it very interesting, that it says there's actually enough water in Delhi, you know, but that water is not available equitably across Delhi. Now I don't know whether that's true or not, because, you know, you can't believe everything that you read, and you've got to do your own research. But the point is that, you know, and we have talked about Cape Town a lot over our 12 days, but Cape Town is already running out of water, and people have been restricted to use 50 liters of water a day. That is very little water. Imagine you have to use it for bathing, for drinking, for cooking, for cleaning, and so, you know, that sort of scenario is quite likely to happen, and I hope it doesn't. But we have to start planning, and we have to start thinking. But I digress. So also at that time in 2012, can you see the screen properly? Otherwise we can switch off the lights in the front. If you can't, it's up to you. But we can switch off. Yeah, that might be better because it's quite small, the print. So in the early 2000s, at the start of this millennium, was also the recognition that we need to bring sustainability into education. At this, up until this point in time, you know, for the last 20 years or so, up until the year 2000, this was all driven by industry, by governments, largely by industry and governments, and some private organizations. But there was not a recognition that we need to start teaching people like yourselves and future professionals about sustainability. And in my view, we don't do enough of that. Because if you are going to be having to face the challenges that we just talked about in terms of increased temperatures, etc., then you need to be armed with the tools to be able to do that. And the only way we can do that as teachers or as educators is to ensure that we expose you to this sort of thinking when you're in your university, when you're learning about the issues around climate change. And none of this is definitive science. We don't really know. So that the fact that you're going to have to make decisions that, you know, is uncertain, that a number of things are going to be unknown to you, is, you know, makes a complex situation even more murkier and even more difficult. But these are the challenges that you're going to have to face as you continue into your professional careers over a period of time. So then coming into, so GAP, which was something that I've put down for 2013, is called the Global Action Program, and some clear guidelines were set up. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but some clear guidelines were set up about how can you start thinking about bringing education into sustainability and what are some of the practical things that you can do. Then closer to where we are now in this decade, 2014, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted at the Muscat Agreement, and there was a conference, a UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. A conference was set up on education for sustainable development, and then it's sort of, you know, there was a drive again from top down to ensure that education for sustainability becomes a part of university education. And you might be doing that already, but maybe it is couched more in terms of vernacular architecture and not really thinking about it from a sustainability perspective. And I think that recognition and those dots have got to be joined for you to be able to perform well as professionals in the future. Then we move on to, and I'll skip on the 2015 because I've already talked about the Paris Agreement, but in 2016, in COP22 in Morocco, the SDGs came into effect. So they came into effect on 1st January 2016, and I'll talk about this SDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals. Sorry, there are some acronyms that I sort of tend to use without thinking about it because I use it all the time. So if you don't understand anything, please raise your hand if I'm using an acronym without actually explaining what they are. Last year we had COP23 that was led by Fiji, but the biggest Fiji is an island in the Pacific. It's actually there are groups of islands in the Pacific with two main islands, and I don't know if you know enough about Fiji, but Fiji has a very small population. The population of Fiji is about 750,000. So it's less than 1 million people that are scattered largely over these two islands and a number of little islands around. The natives of Fiji are the Fijians, who tend to look a little bit like Africans. So they're dark skinned and they have got curly hair, very broad features. And a number of the islands in the Pacific like Samoa, Numia, Tonga, they all tend to have these sort of groups of people. And then you have some, so they're called the Melanesians, and then you have the Polynesians, who are the people who are fair-skinned, like the Hawaiians, who are fair-skinned, you know, they come from Tahiti, Samoa, as well as the Maoris, the natives of New Zealand as well, the Maoris. So Fiji as an island, and a number of these Pacific islands, in fact, are all realistically facing threats of climate change. As the sea levels are rising, these people are losing a large part of their islands. They're losing a large part of their traditional fishing activity because you know, part of their diet is fish. So they're losing that, and the climate is changing as well. Frequent storms and cyclones. You know, traditionally Fiji would have a cyclone that would wipe out settlements, you know, once in 5 years. This was about 20 years ago. Now almost every year they may not have one, but they may have 2 cyclones that affects them. So these climate refugees are increasingly becoming a reality, and it is incumbent upon richer nations, in my view, in this world, to try and rehabilitate them and take in these climate refugees. So these sort of things are part and parcel now of the discussions that are going on around climate change. And as I said, COP24 this year is going to be in Poland. So along with the Sustainable Development Goals is a new urban agenda. And this new urban agenda was released as part of Habitat 3, which is an international conference that takes place once a decade. So this was the 3rd one, Habitat 3 being the 3rd one. And the new urban agenda was rolled out as part of this. And this links very closely to the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'll talk about the Sustainable Development Goals in a minute. And so this agenda is focused largely on housing. Habitat is about housing, is about people's basic needs. And there's a large proportion currently on the planet that don't have access to this basic housing need. And particularly in countries such as India as well as countries in Africa. So this agenda that was set up was stated as being of the people, by the people, and for the people. And there are 5 P's. It is built on the principles of 5 P's: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. We're not doing very well currently on peace for obvious reasons with the things that are going on in Syria, but hopefully we will be able to eliminate that as well. And so the focus that, it's one planet, there are people on this planet, and there's no equity about the people on this planet. Together we all need to prosper, and we can only do that through the principles of partnership. So the Sustainable Development Goals didn't just appear out of nowhere. There were actually a number of things that happened, and I showed you the timeline. There are a number of other things on the timeline which I have skipped, but I've just highlighted the main milestones. So it has been built on things that happened in the past. For example, the Rio Declaration, I talked about Agenda 21 that came as a result of that. There was a World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002, and then there was a World Summit for Social Development that came just not long after the Rio Declaration in '95, as well as the International Conference on Population and Development, and 2 conferences that took place, one in 1994 and 20 years later in 2014. And then, as I said before, this came into effect on the 1st of January 2016, and the time period for this is 15 years. So it is from a period of 2015 to 2030, and hopefully by then we would have made a large dent in what we have seen as largely, up until this point in time, a lot of talk about sustainability, but actually not much action on the ground. So this is intended to be clear actions on the ground to try and build the momentum towards climate change and sustainability. So OWG is an open working group, and this is part of the UN number of working groups. So I've talked about the 5 P's. I'm not going to dwell on this in greater detail, but you can see that these 5 P's are also linked quite closely with the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'll show you in a minute. So the Sustainable Development Goals has got 17 goals and 169 targets. And I don't know if you can see this clearly. I'm sorry, so I'll read them out to you. Yeah. So the 17 goals, and I hope the message is very clear when I've read out all the 17 goals. Each of these goals refer to the environmental part of the role that we need to play on the planet. So the recognition that our environment is severely degrading and is continuously being degraded over a period of time. The social side, which is about how we live, our behavioral practices, how we treat each other, and how do we engage with each other, because we are all together in this quest, and a recognition that we have just this one planet, so we've got to use our resources wisely. And then of course is the economical part of it, which is a large driver of industry and economic activity around the world. So how do we again continue to decouple economic growth with environmental issues? So goal 1 is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Very social in terms of its approach. Goal 2 is to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. Goal 3 is to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. It's very inclusive. Goal 4 is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So for a lot of people, and this is again where a lot of the work has been done on UNESCO and on education for sustainability, has tended to focus largely on primary education and secondary education, and not much on what is happening at a tertiary level. And I think this is where we need to start focusing our attention on, so that when young graduates move into their professional world, they are equipped with the theoretical knowledge that they need to try and combat all the different challenges that they're facing today. Goal 5 is to achieve gender equity, equality, and empower all women and girls. So very much focused on the fair agenda, if I may. Goal number 6 is to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation. And need I say more with all the crises that we're facing worldwide in relation to water and access to potable water. Goal number 7 is to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Goal number 8 is to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Goal number 9 is to build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. Goal number 10 is to reduce inequality within and among countries. Goal number 11 is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So resilient is a term that is used in relation to adaptation and mitigation in relation to climate change. So what does resiliency mean? Resiliency means the ability for something to bounce back. So what is the resiliency of our earth with all the degradation that has already taken place and the amount of time that it is going to need to bounce back to what it was about 100 years ago or 200 years ago, and so on. So resiliency is a very important word that is now coming into discussions around climate change and sustainability. Ensuring, goal number 12 is ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. Goal number 13 is to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Goal 14 is to conserve and sustainably use oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Goal number 15, coming to the end now, is to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, halt and reverse land degradation, and halt biodiversity loss. Goal number 16 is to promote peaceful, inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. And the last goal, 17, is to strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. Now, you will note that I have highlighted some of these in blue. And these are the goals that I believe link directly to the built environment. All these goals link to the built environment because built environment is where we interact on a daily basis. But in particular, goal 4, which is about education, goal 7, which is about access to energy, goal 9, which is about infrastructure, goal 11 about cities, about making cities and human settlements inclusive and safe, goal number 12 on sustainable consumption and production, goal number 13 in terms of taking urgent action for climate change and its impacts, and goal number 17, which is on partnerships. So these are the goals that are very closely linked. In fact, all these goals are linked together, and these are a package. They are indivisible. So it's not as if one goal is more of a in terms of a pecking order, more important than another goal or more significant than another goal. However, it is left to countries to then prioritize what goals they see as being the top priority. For example, in India, housing is a top priority. Sanitation is a top priority, and there are a number of schemes that have been done at a federal level to support these. So as I said before, these goals just don't focus on the economic and the environmental side of sustainability, they focus on the social side. So here is another way you see these different goals being expressed. I'll talk a little bit about goal number 12 because I'm involved with goal number 12. So goal number 12, just to remind you, is focusing on sustainable consumption and production patterns. As a result of the Rio Plus 20 in 2012, there was a recognition that we are just talking about how do we act in relation to climate change and sustainability, but we're not really doing anything. So under goal number 12, this 10-year framework was set up. And again, you won't be able to read, so I will. For example, under goal number 12, the first goal says to implement the 10-year framework of programs in sustainable consumption and production, all countries taking action with developed countries taking the lead, taking into account the development and capabilities of developing countries. So you can see that there is room for developed countries to pull along developing countries, countries like India, China, Philippines, countries in Africa, Latin America, so to pull them along and to bring them on a path of sustainable development. So that inequity that has been existing in the planet up until this point in time, and probably will continue to exist, but will hopefully not be the stark contrast that it has been over in the past. And there's also recognition that even though a lot of activities are taking place under consumption and production, goal number 12, these goals are interlinked with other goals, other sustainable development goals. For example, on decent work and economic growth, which is goal number 8, as well as the other ones that I highlighted in the previous slide. So what is the 10-year framework of programs about? It's a 10-year framework. So it started in 2012 and it will go until 2022. So we're almost at the midway point now. In fact, we had quite an extensive review that took place last year. And I'll read because again you might have difficulty reading from the back. So it says to accelerate the shift towards sustainable consumption and production to promote social and economic development within the carrying capacity of the ecosystem by addressing and where appropriate decoupling economic growth, which I've already talked about, from environmental degradation by improving efficiency and sustainability in the use of resources and production processes and reducing resource degradation, pollution and waste. So this obviously, as you can see, has got a huge impact on the built environment. So just a slide there, interesting. Okay, I did this very late in the night, so that's probably why. So just to focus now a little bit about the 10-year framework of programs. There are 6 programs within the 10-year framework. And one of those programs is Sustainable Buildings and Consumption Program. The other 5 programs, Sustainable Procurement Program, Sustainable Tourism Program, Sustainable Consumer Information Program, Sustainable Lifestyles and Education, and Sustainable Food Systems. So our program was launched in 2015 as part of one of the conferences, Habitat conferences, leading up to the big Habitat conference in 2016. These are the people that are in the driving seat of the program, the lead and the co-lead team. So the program is led by the Ministry of Environment in Finland, and the co-leads are RMIT University. So I'm from RMIT University and I'm one of the co-leads, as well as a UN Environment based in Paris. And then we have a number of other stakeholders globally that we interact with. So for example, we've got a meeting that's taking place in Argentina very soon, in a couple of weeks, where we are going to meet with people from across the world. And you might well ask the question, why do you need to meet face to face? Why do you need to fly? And why do you need to emit pollution and greenhouse gas emissions in the process of flying? We only meet once a year face to face. All our other activities are undertaken through video links, through teleconferences. So we try and not travel as much as we can, but we do, because this program, when the program started in 2015, we were all strangers. We didn't know each other. I just knew that the Ministry of Environment Finland was the lead of the program. And they knew that somebody by the name of Usha from RMIT was one of the co-leads. And likewise, at that time, there was somebody else from UN Environment called Kurt Garrigan. Of course, I knew Kurt, but that's a different story. So a lot of us were strangers, and we didn't know each other. So we actually all met for the first time in 2015, along with what we call a multi-stakeholder advisory committee, or a MAC members, who come from different parts of the world. And being an initiative of the UN, there's a lot of importance given to global balance. So it should not be very Eurocentric, or it should not be very North American centric, or Asia Pacific centric. So we have tried to bring in players, and different sorts of players. So we have academics and researchers, we have international government IGOs, international government organizations, such as UN Habitat and UNOPS, which is the procurement arm of UN. We have also got a number of huge players in the marketplace called the International Finance Corporation, which is an arm of the World Bank. Not that they give us money, but you know, it's good to get these different sorts of players in, because we have to work together. Goal number 17 is about partnership, and we need to try and link these, join these dots wherever possible and link with each other to try and ensure that action on the ground takes place. How does this thing work? This is just for your information, because I know many of you may not know how the UN works. It's an extremely bureaucratic organization. So you have on the bottom right hand corner where all the different logos are put for how the SBC, the drivers of the SBC program are sitting. We interact, as I said, with our MAC members, our multi-stakeholder advisory committee members. We also have a number of partners. So, for example, MITs can become a partner of the program. By becoming a partner of the program, you can get access to a lot of collateral, a lot of information that we are developing and we are sharing. There are webinars and things, and we attended one of these webinars last week on circular economy and examples of where circular economy has been practiced in different parts of the world. And then we have a number of different stakeholders, which is largely the building and construction industry. But then we also have a secretariat that supports us, and that secretariat reports to the 10YFP board. And the board changes on an 18 months to 2 year basis. So when we started, we had a different board. Now we have a different board. And the board takes a responsibility for ensuring that all the 6 programs are given enough support, are given enough focus, and that was part of the review that took place last year. And enough in terms of direction and strategic direction, particularly for the next 5 years. There's also a trust fund, which a number of different countries that sit on the board have supported. So that's how we get some funds to support demonstration activities in the program. So for example, I'll encourage you to go and have a look at the website. But for example, there is a project that is taking place currently in India called the MASHIP project, Mainstreaming Sustainable Social Housing in India program, where we're looking at not house as just as a product, but housing as a process, and how can we bring in sustainability across the supply chain. And we, as part of this work, we have got 5 case studies in different parts of India, one in Jaipur, which is where I'm going next week. So this is Jaipur, there's Dehradun, there is Hyderabad, and interestingly, you know, when Maharashtra, so these are the different social housing projects. I would have thought that there would be a lot more engagement with the local resources that are available within these regions. So for example, laterite is a stone that's locally available in Gwalior, so it would make sense that you would use buildings made out of your local material. And likewise in different parts of the country. And not surprisingly, you know, all these were made out of brick and cement. So standard cement, brick, steel, glass. So there was really no recognition of the sort of materials coming from local areas. And if we are all using the same sorts of materials, then we are actually increasing the amount of embodied energy that goes into those materials. So what I say, what do I mean by when I say embodied energy? To manufacture cement is highly energy intensive. To use aluminium is highly energy intensive, because you need to mine the aluminium from the ore. There's an environmental impact as a result of mining that aluminium. It then needs to go to a smelter. The aluminium needs to be made, and then it needs to be converted into products. And this can happen in different parts of the world. So if you want to try and reduce and have an impact on the supply chain and be careful about your procurement practices, then you have to be really thinking about where are these materials coming from, and how much energy is going into the use and into the manufacture of these, and how many jobs from a social perspective, how much skilling and upbuilding, and how many jobs are being created at a local level. So all these things are very, very important. These are just some of the things. There's a lot more that you need to think about. And then is the ECOSOC, which is the Economic and Social Committee of the UN, and that is where, you know, giant players. I don't know if you've kept up with the news to see what has been happening at UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement. All the big players in the world are part of the Economic and Social Council. So this is how the program works. So some of the other partners in the program, I talked about partners. So as I said before, we have got a number of, particularly from India, we have got RICS SB. There's also Sabarmati Samiti from India as well. That is one of our partners. And then we have, over the last 2 years, we're almost 3 years now into the program. So what is it that we have done? So we have got, I talked about MASHIP in India. We've got another demonstration project in Africa. We've got another project that's taking place looking at planning and building regulations in Colombia. And then in addition to that, the government of Finland gave additional funds because when we set out the expression of interest to get proposals from different parts of the world for awarding funds, there were 2 other projects that we felt were worthy of getting funds and should be on the ground. So one is on smart cities and the other one is on use of low embodied cement, a type of cement in the Colombian region in Latin America. So these are some of the projects that we're working on. In addition to that, I won't go into the detail. We have done a lot of networking events, and like when I travel as part of my job, I often talk about my other role, which is as co-lead of the Sustainable Buildings and Construction Program, and we are working on a lot of developing knowledge base through our webinars and so on. This is just to show the geographical spread. As you can see, we don't have very many, either a partner or a player from the Russian region, but as you can see, Europe is quite well represented. Not very much from Africa. We've got in bits and bobs, China and India. We've got actually 2 partners and 2 MAC members from India. There's just myself at the moment from Australia, but there's some partners there as well. So what are our main work areas? So we work on, and you can see on the right hand side, we've got on the left hand side you can see our work streams, and on the right hand side you can see what are each of these work streams referring to. So we want to develop enabling framework. So using the principles of sustainability wherever you might be in different parts of the world, within a developed or developing country. We have a particular focus on sustainable housing. As you can see, that's one of the projects in housing was awarded to India. We're also interested in sustainability in the supply chain, as well as anything and everything that we can do to reduce climate impact. We have also got a particular focus on circular economy. This has come through over the last 2 years. A growing recognition that as part of collaboration activities, we need to build up the principles of circular economy, and hopefully the video will work. So you might need to get Santosh in case it doesn't. The role and the importance of circular economy in buildings and construction, and how can we try and reuse and more recyclable materials into our building and construction. How do we not have demolition waste going into the landfill, but using some of that back into as products that we can use for building and construction. Health issues, reducing the value of construction and demolition waste, and sharing practices wherever possible. So let's see if this thing works. It's a very short clip to show you what circular economy means. This doesn't have internet connection. No. Whoop. Okay, maybe I'll show this at the end. If you can get Santosh, then we can try and do it at the end. Oh, wait for program to respond. Restart.
I don't know.
Kind of virus. No, no, it's already there.
It's like that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So that's pretty normal. But this does have internet connection, doesn't it?
Yeah, it has. We were going to play the story of stuff after this.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, we'll try and show that at the end. Okay, those people get. Okay, so then just to give you an idea of who are some of those other players across the other programs other than the buildings and construction program. So you can see here again it's a combination of different agencies including government agencies. These are the different themes that we started with in the program, capacity building for example, resources, water, housing that I've already talked about, health and safety, energy and so on. And each of these responds to types of the goals, the sustainable development goals. And as I said to you, some of these have already highlighted to you, but there's obviously a lot more. Okay, so let's now take a step back from the UN and its different agencies and then think a little bit about, and I want you to have a discussion amongst yourselves because I don't like to always talk. And Ayushi is smiling. Yes?
Ma'am, what are you doing to deal with those economic giants who simply refuse to believe that climate change is happening? Like a lot of Republicans from the United States, they just don't believe it.
There is a fantastic audio visual called The Great Global Warming Swindle. I think you should watch that because that has been put up by skeptics. And I think you should, Ayushi, you want to tell him? About?
There is so much of refusal.
What's the video?
Sorry?
What's the video you want to run?
Yeah.
You can watch that movie before, the Untitled Chapter. You might get the perspective of what actually is going on and how this so much importance to this topic, but what are the refusals given to this topic and how they are related.
This is the video I want to play, but it's not loading up.
सेपरेट नहीं है, सेपरेट नहीं है विदाउट PPT.
Oh, you can cut and paste it. You can cut and paste it into the browser. You can copy and paste this in the browser. So was your question answered by Ayushi?
Yes,
Yeah.
more or less.
ये सपोर्ट नहीं कर रहा मैम, स्क्रिप्ट है ना ये, इसको सपोर्ट नहीं कर रहा ये अपना जो इंटरफेस है ऑफिस वाला.
Okay, so if you open Internet Explorer and you just put it in there, you should be able to play it. Enter. Open a new one. Yeah, here you go. Okay.
The themes of resource efficiency and circular economy in the construction sector, which is the #1 consumer of global raw materials. The use of buildings account for 40% of global energy, 25% of global water, 40% of global resources,
Okay.
Then you will
gas emissions. Between 1900 and 2005, the global use of material resources increased by a factor of 8, almost twice as fast as the rate by which the global population grew, while the use of construction materials increased by a factor of 34. We have tremendous opportunities to better the efficiency of our use of resources. 10 to 15% of building materials are wasted during construction. 60% of European offices are not used even in working hours. 50% of residential dwellers report living in too much space. 20 to 40% of the energy used in existing buildings could profitably be conserved. 54% of demolition materials are sent to landfill, while in some countries landfill is only 6%. And 40% of all extracted materials are stored in the building environment, which provides an enormous reservoir for reuse and recycling. EU manufacturing could realize net cost savings of up to $630 billion annually in raw materials by deploying a circular economy approach, and approaching circular economy principles could significantly enhance the productivity of the global construction industry, saving at least $100 billion a year. The Sustainable Development Goals of the SBC program are to achieve a healthy building environment, provide capacity building to different stakeholders, increase water use efficiency, ensure access to affordable, reliable and modern energy services, improve resource efficiency, promote sustainable industrialization and foster innovation, support job creation to all genders and the youth, enhance the planning and management of sustainable human settlements, encourage companies to adopt sustainable practices, strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity, restore degraded land and ensure sustainable use of ecosystems, and finally, build on initiatives for knowledge sharing and cooperation. Our vision is a local circular economy to analyze global material flows to inform local networks and design buildings for material recovery, lower the cost of waste separation, replace energy-intensive materials and save raw materials, protect the informal sector and encourage the use of organic building materials. Invest in local circular economies and divert materials from land use, and raise the value of reuse materials and improve the prospects for the informal markets. A good example of using side streams from other industries in construction comes from India, where fly ash is used to make building products for walls or pavements. Machinery of different scales is available for startup companies. The Helsinki Maapörssi in Finland is an online recycling service to facilitate and coordinate the direct exchange of demolition aggregates and ground-fill materials. In Malawi, the use of traditionally fired clay bricks can now be substituted with a more environmentally friendly eco-brick, manufactured with vertical shaft brick kiln technology, which reduces the consumption of firewood and deforestation. Visit our SBC program website for more information and get in touch.
Okay, so I hope you found that video useful. Now coming back to the built environment, as you saw in the video quite clearly, we do need the built environment, and I said this before, we do need the built environment for resources that we use, and then we tend to put our waste back into the built environment as well. And in the process of putting waste back into the earth, we could contaminate things. You know, there's air pollution, there's water pollution, there's pollution to the soil. So in other words, we also need to be careful about the sorts of materials that are going back into the earth. And when you look at particularly in urban areas, and particularly in countries like India, the pace of change, the urban growth that's taking place is unprecedented. So India currently is going through a huge phase of building airports, building roads, building rails, building your infrastructure, building cities, you know. So there's a lot happening. A lot of types of buildings are being built in a place like India. And if that building in construction that is going on is not put into the path of a low carbon, low water use, low energy efficient buildings, then we are doomed, because that energy that has already been built in the process of extraction and you know, resource extraction, etc., is already, that's called the embodied energy. That's already in place. But buildings, once they're built, are going to last for 80 to 100 years. And when you're using buildings, you need to use light, you need to use air conditioning, you need to use products, you need to use fixtures and fittings inside buildings. And so if these are not done in an energy efficient manner or water efficient manner, we're going to keep consuming high energy, high water for the next 80 or 100 years. So that is why it is really important to ensure that all this construction that is taking place is on the right path. So the materials used are right, the impact when you're building the building itself is low, so that in terms of its operational use as well as, so if you look at the total life cycle of a building, which includes its capital, that is building the building, includes the operation, and in the operation phase, there's also maintenance, because buildings need to be maintained over a period of time, like you might give it a lick of paint, you might need to change your roof tiles, there's a number of things that you do to the building. So this whole process, the total life cycle needs to be much lower than what we have traditionally been using over a period of time. So if in this process we can try and bring back the principles of circular economy, then we will all be winners in the process. So I hope that's clear to you. So that is why there's a lot of focus now on cities, because if you look at the population of the world, nearly 7 billion people on the planet, about 50% of people, if not already, particularly in countries like India, China, Brazil, Mexico, Philippines, if they're not already living in cities, they will be living, and particularly the Asia Pacific is going to be where 50% of the world population is going to be living in by 2030. So there's a huge focus, therefore, on how do we build cities. And that is why we need to start thinking about the principles of incorporating sustainable development into what we do. So let me now show you very briefly about India's commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I want to bring you back to something that is not new in India, and that is Gandhi's comment, which he made many years ago, where he said, "Earth has enough resources to meet people's needs, but will never have enough to satisfy people's greed." And unfortunately, the developed countries in this world have followed on the path of people's greed rather than people's need. And so, you know, we are now in the situation where, and if you get an opportunity to see The Inconvenient Truth, the sequel of The Inconvenient Truth, you can see in the movie how countries like India have negotiated very strongly to ensure that, you know, they have the opportunity to continue to grow, but it's at what cost, and how do we achieve that growth without damaging the environment on a permanent basis. So there are 41 sustainable development goals that India has set out. So out of that 17, they have then built up that 17 and a combination of the 17 into 41 SDGs. And each of these are and you'll know better than me, are the responsibility of a department called the Niti Aayog. And so these are some of the things that are part of India's National Determined Contributions, NDCs, as part of its report for how well they're performing as far as the sustainable development goals are concerned. So clean and efficient energy system, enhancing energy efficiency both in residential and non-residential or commercial buildings, and part of this is to bring in energy efficient building codes. Also the support and how can you apply the energy efficient building codes, because energy is only one part of a big mix of other things that needs to be considered in the built environment. So one of that is a tool called Griha. And the Prime Minister has been supporting very much at a national scale about Make in India. So, and I know this has been being practiced over certain things that you do. For example, during Diwali, you may not buy crackers that are made in China, but you're supporting the ones that are made in India. Moving towards waterless Holi, so where you're not wasting water. So these are some of the practices, important behavioral practices that need to be considered as well. So as part of this Make in India, India is also building national industrial corridors to support manufacturing back into the country. climate resilient urban centers are being created. So moving away from urban centers that follow the path of where Australia or the UK or the US was about 50 or 80 years ago. Converting waste to wealth. So again, looking at the principles of circular economy. Smart, safe, and green transport. So bringing greener energy sources back into urban areas and using it for particular things, whether it may be in buildings, whether it may be in things like green transport. Planned afforestation, so ensuring that there's enough carbon sink back into the country. So large tracts of forest land have already been culled. So bringing that back into the country and promoting and supporting such forms of planned afforestation, which also in turn has an impact on the urban heat island effect. So when the more built areas you have, the more heat is absorbed by these, and particularly cement and asphalt are the big culprits here. And then this is re-radiated back at night time. And so the local temperatures tend to increase. So you end up having these contours in urban areas because they're all paved, they're largely built up, because they don't have enough greenery. And this also then upsets water tables as well, because there's surface runoff into the stormwater drains, which then gets discharged into the ocean or into the rivers, without actually allowing the groundwater tables to be able to soak in the water. So these are all some of those other practices that are a result of bad planning. So these are some of the things that need to be taken into consideration. Pollution abatement, and Gwalior in particular is one of the worst cities in India as far as air pollution is concerned. Why? Because I've been told you've got quarries around Gwalior, but also because Gwalior is in a sump. So there's not enough wind movement to take away the pollution in Gwalior. So as a result, people living in Gwalior are the sufferers. So this has a direct impact on human health. And at the end of the day, health is something that everybody values. So that's a common denominator to try and improve our cities. And then involving citizens in combating climate change. So what are the sorts of things that you can do? So don't think just because everything is done by the government or has to be driven by the government, you don't have any role to play in this. And Ayusha can give you examples of some of the things that we've discussed over the last 12 days. Swachh Bharat Mission, again, this is a baby by the Prime Minister, which came into effect in 2014 with a 5-year window where there is total sanitation across the country. So every house, every village to have a toilet. Now, whether these toilets actually get used or not is another issue. So there's a behavioral aspect that needs to be considered within this as well. So use of solar energy wherever possible, use of recyclable materials wherever possible, and segregation of waste. India does have also its State of India's Environment reports, and you please feel free to go and have a look at it on the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Climate Change website. And they are the nodal agency in India, but not just within India, but also in the region. So India does have a leadership role to play in the region, particularly within the SAARC context, which Indira Gandhi started many years ago. So here's a little bit about what the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Climate Change is responsible for. They're responsible for conservation and survey of flora, fauna. So they're the pulse. They keep a consensus check on what's going on in different parts of the country. Pollution, afforestation, regeneration of degraded areas, protection of the environment and welfare of animals. So in terms of climate change, India has got its own NDCs, which you've already talked about, and the role of all of these different actions are to try and reduce our emissions intensity. So GDP stands for gross domestic product, which is a measure of how well countries are performing economically. And so the goal is to reduce emissions by almost a third by 2030. And India has also said that 40% share of fuel is now going to come from non-fossil fuel sources, so from renewable sources, which may be hydro, which may be solar, which may be geothermal, whatever it might be, and also to enhance carbon sink in the country. So I'll not talk about this, but this is further detail about some of the other areas that have been prioritized, 8 missions by the National Action Plan on Climate Change, and you can have a look at this later on. I can make the slides available to you. Other things in relation to climate change, so moving beyond buildings, but also to transportation, which is a huge issue in India, looking at things like, use of ethanol in petrol, phasing out completely use of lead in cars, and therefore you only have unleaded petrol available, and so on. So I'll now pause because my throat is beginning to dry out. I'll now pause, but let you have maybe discussions in 3 groups. Maybe one group can be there, one group at the back, and or maybe just 2 groups here. And I want you to just have a thought, because you're going to be charged with having to roll out and ensure that India's nationally determined contributions are actually going to be put into practice. Because are you all on an average 3rd-year architecture students? So you'll all be graduating in two years out into the world of work, and it'll be tasked, your responsibility, it'll be tasked, the country will task you with ensuring that these NDCs are met. So do you think they're realistic? And how do you think the built environment supports or does not support these? And if you think you have a role to play, what role do you think you have to play? So I'll leave you to just have a chat amongst yourselves for maybe 10 minutes. Sure.
It's written over there. Are India's NDCs realistic? So I want to ask, are developed countries' missions are realistic? Are they being practiced, or they are just being discussed?
I think that's a really fair point. What's your name? Divya. That Divya has raised, and it comes back to, and again I would really strongly advise you to watch Truth to Power, which is a sequel of Intelligence.
Hello, I'm Pekka Huovila, and I'm coordinating the Sustainable Buildings and Construction Program, which is part of the United Nations 10-year framework of programs for sustainable construction and production. I will be talking on Tuesday in the climate change session on how to support and mainstream sustainable building practices globally. And I look forward to seeing you there in Hong Kong to debate these opportunities and also to extend and strengthen our networks.
So Divya, that's a valid question, and yes, some developed countries are serious about it, other developed countries are not serious about it. So for example, the US, which has traditionally led the movement for a number of things, they have completely pulled out of sustainability and climate change, but other countries have stepped in. So there's a lot happening, for example, in Europe. Europe, for example, has got codes now towards net zero energy emissions, and regardless of Trump's policies in the US, the architecture community through Architecture 2030 in the US have also signed up to zero energy codes. Other countries in the Asian region that have also signed up to net zero energy is Japan, Korea, China. India has also got a roadmap for net zero energy. So the answer to your question is yes. But the important point in all of this is we have to go back, we have to do monitoring and evaluation, and we have to go back and check to make sure that we've actually met our goals. And if we don't, that's where I think we're going to be in strife. So the important part in all of this is that if the monitoring and evaluation is not there, there's no way for us to know whether we're on the right path and whether we're actually implementing all we said that we're going to do. Any other questions? So I put it back to this. You guys are hesitating to talk to each other? I thought you would welcome the opportunity to talk. Okay. Is he taping? Is he recording this as well? No. Okay. Ayushi, can you? You don't have to turn it off, but you could even turn it up, because I don't know how comfortable people are at the back. Oh, is this the one? No. Yes.
How can MITs become a part of this movement?
Good question. I've already spoken to Dr. Pandit and Anjali. So I've asked MITs to become a partner. And I want you all to take responsibility for your own environment. Become more proactive in what you do.
You mean we just have to be naturally aware and there is no official protocol that we have to follow?
No, to become a partner of the Sustainable Buildings and Construction Program, you have to officially apply. So that, don't worry about that. That's something that will be taken care of by the relevant people here. But in terms of what you will be doing as professional, as architects in the future, I want you to be mindful about the way you're designing buildings, and make buildings more energy efficient, ensure that buildings respond to the local climate, but not just in terms of what's happening to the climate now, but also think about what will happen in the future. Because if you're only thinking about energy efficiency from a mitigation perspective, so to reduce your emissions, and not thinking about adaptation, so if you're not thinking about, those examples that I gave before of thank you, of storm surges and flooding and things like that, then you may have design responses that are only thinking about mitigation but not thinking about adaptation. Okay, so you need to think, and this is difficult. This is because nobody really knows what's going to happen in the future. So you could be expecting something to happen in the future and design for that, and it might turn out that's not the case. So we've got to start thinking about, and in the circular economy video, I can't remember now whether it was this one or another one, you can actually build buildings to be demountable. So for example, don't use glues. If you use glues, then when you stick things onto products, you can't reuse them again, because the minute you glue them, you're bringing in toxins into the product, and it's difficult to separate them. So nailing is always better. So you can remove the nails and then you can separate the products. So things like that, as designers, I think there's lots of things that you can think about, innovative solutions that you can come up with. So buildings, for example, if you were designing office buildings, then what happens if that, the use of that office space needs to become something else? So thinking about adaptive use of designs, and we had some discussions about sports stadiums. How do we readapt sports stadiums so they're not just looking at for the purposes of sporting facilities, but could be used for other things as well. So any thoughts in relation to the three questions that I have posed to you? So do you think that India's NDCs are realistic? Do you think that India can achieve all these different NDCs that we talked about? Yes, no, don't care?
I mean, depends on time. Like after a certain period of time, things changes. So the approach is about change. Like it will come after a time, not right now, but someday.
Yeah, go on.
I have a question. Like an architect is making a sustainable design, but but it is not only the job of architect. The user also have a purpose. Like बस हम डिजाइन नहीं करते हैं, हम किसी के साइकोलॉजी के लिए करते हैं, सोच नहीं करते हैं, लेकिन हमेशा पर्सन टू पर्सन the psychology changes, and we don't know that what is the actual number of people or type of people who are going to use that.
Absolutely.
Every time the design is not according to a certain typology of person. So I want to ask, like, so what we can do about that? Definitely we design for people, but it's not that people are using everything.
So what do you think? So what do you think? So do you think your responsibility as an architect just ends up with doing the design and giving it to them? You don't think that it's part of your professional responsibility to also educate them?
Exactly, ma'am. But we are not doing this.
So what's stopping?
That is our responsibility. We should carry on this thought that we are the designers, not just of the building envelope, but the society and the culture we build. We make people live as we want. And so that is how we require to inculcate these habits of sustainability, getting acquainted with all these things, and then adopting it and making people do that through the building envelope.
So my clear response to you will be, if you haven't been doing that, or if you think that's not part of your job, I think you should change your attitude and you should say, this is part of my role. As an architect, part of my role is not just to and I'm sure there will be people in the world who will do that. You know, there will still be people, and we've seen this happen over the last 50-100 years, as cities of the Asia Pacific and Latin America have become more and more urbanized. Regardless of the climatic and regardless of the cultural context, we're still having buildings of glass and steel. If I showed you a photo of Singapore, showed you a photo of Shanghai, showed you a photo of Philippines, showed you a photo of Delhi, no difference. There's no difference between them. They're all the same. And you will see that for all of them, there'll be equally cloudy, polluted environment as part of the skyscraper set of buildings. So this is where your role as an architect becomes really important, and how you influence not just yourself, but your fellow architects and your other fellow professionals. So when you work with engineers, when you work with ESD consultants, when you work with your contractors, so ensure that those practices that you have been taught are also practiced. Because if you're only talking about theory, nothing's going to happen. So we might have 52 NDCs instead of 41 for India. We're never going to achieve it if we don't practice it. If we don't monitor it, if we don't evaluate it, if we don't build on it. It's always going to be just talk and not action. And that has been the big difference. You know, I didn't talk to you about the Millennium Development Goals, but that's been the big difference between what has happened at the world scale up until this point in time and going back to Paris. It has become really incumbent upon all of us not to just think about it, but to act. That action and the proactive role that we play as citizens on this planet is very, very critical. Not just to ensure each individual person's survival, but for us to globally survive. And that's why goal number 17 is so very critical, because it's about partnership. So if you look at the second one, how does the built environment support? There should have been a hyphen, a backslash there, support or not support these. So what do you think? Do you think that if you only look at NDCs that respond to waste or water or afforestation, do you think that built environment has got a role to play in that or not? Yes, it does. Because, you know, when you use wood, you could be using wood from forests that have been there for hundreds and thousands of years, and not from plantation forests. So you have got to make sure that you choose the right product. So likewise, you know, when you're choosing building materials, try and use as much local building materials as possible. Yes, Divya.
As we discussed, I think this passion of monotony, building similar things and following others, is the biggest threat which we face today in world of architecture, in our culture, everywhere. This passion is affecting us a lot. So that is directly related to this built environment.
Yes, absolutely. I call that the cookie cutter approach. So you know what a cookie cutter is? You have that mold, and then you just keep cutting, and then you have all of them the same, right? So we need to move away from that glass and steel, and looking at buildings, it doesn't matter which part you're in the world, they all look the same, right? That's not what we as individuals are about. We love different foods, different types of food. We may all have different religious backgrounds. We come from different parts of India and indeed globally. So that diversity, and diversity of not just human beings, but diversity of flora and fauna is also important for the planet to survive. If we don't have the diversity of flora and fauna, then we're totally screwed. So that is also an important thing to recognize. And therefore, the response should be very much based on, as a local response, rather than as, a cookie cutter approach, a prescriptive response. Any other thoughts? What about the final one? Do you have a role to play? And I think we've talked about it already. Is there anybody who disagrees? It's okay. You're not going to. If anybody disagrees, I would like to know why. Why would you disagree? So is there anyone who disagrees? Too scared. Okay, so shall we move on?
That may be your word as a disagreement.
Yeah.
That from the point of looking at it as a profession, as an architect we may not survive if
we don't design according to the client's wants.
You should say that.
But it is our responsibility to educate our clients. Nobody disagrees with that. But it is also true that clients generally they only look at the cost factor and they won't consider how environment friendly they are.
But you can speak to Anjali about the cost factor. She convinced her client not to knock down a building and refurbish it instead. Yeah. Because she gave the most people will want to know the cost. And if you are able to demonstrate and show them that the cost is either negligible or the cost is lower, which of course then you won your argument, or even if the cost is higher, but what is the benefit they're getting for that? For a lot of people, if they're getting a better quality of life, and if they're getting a better habitat for themselves to live in, then they will be prepared to pay more. There will be a lot of people who are prepared to do that, and that is important, because at the end of the day, when you damage your environment, you still need to rehabilitate that, and that is often even more expensive, and some of it you cannot recover. It's just not possible. Species that have already become extinct, they're not going to come back, they're gone. So there is a loss that can never be recovered, and sometimes even on geological scales. So that sort of time frame is a very important aspect that you need to consider. So try and convince your client, but at the end of the day, it's your decision, and nobody can tell you. If you're starting out as a young architect, of course you spend 5 years, you need to get your own return on investment for the efforts that you have put in, and that's your individual choice to make. And maybe you don't make that choice now. Maybe you continue to build, but one day your conscience will prick you, and then you'll have to face yourself, your own conscience, to do that. But that's an individual decision. And nobody can force you to do that. Okay, so how much time do I have? Because I might.
The audience will tell.
How much time do you want to give me? It's up to you. I've got a lot of things to talk about. As my 2-star students will tell you.
They have the ITM students have
half an hour. Okay. So I'm going to skip all this and I'm going to go straight to showing you some examples of sustainability. Okay. Okay, and this is a project that is very close to my heart, and I want to show this project to you, because I spent 5 years convincing my university to start
examining their buildings and doing undertaking a post-occupancy evaluation. So I'll explain what a post-occupancy evaluation is in a minute. But most architects, once they build a building, and particularly the building has won a number of awards, will only talk about the things that are absolutely fantastic about the building. They're never going to go back and they're never going to check what are the things that didn't work in the building, and there would be. I mean, I would find it very hard to believe that in the whole process of concept design to actual building to actual operation, things haven't gone wrong. It's almost impossible, right? So nobody talks about mistakes. Nobody talks about things that have gone wrong. And to me, an important part of the learning exercise is to talk about the things that have gone wrong and to share the things that have gone wrong. Because if we don't, then we're never actually going to get better with what we do. So for me, closing that loop is really important. So I'm going to talk about a few case studies in Australia, and then I'll come to the case study of my own university. And this is just to give you a flavor of, some of the things that are taking place in Australia and the rest of the world. So here's an example of Lochiel Park. Lochiel Park is a suburb that was built in Adelaide, one of the cities. For those of you who follow cricket would know that some of the World Cup games are played in Adelaide as well. Adelaide is a much smaller city than Melbourne and Sydney. Sydney and Melbourne are the bigger cities with a population of close to 5 million. Adelaide has a population of just over 1 million. So, about the size of Gwalior, about a population of 1 million. And this suburban development called Lochiel Park was driven by the state government. So the role of state government leadership in this project is very, very important and very, very critical. So they decided a few years ago that in this development, they wanted to try and sensitize, and Divya, you asked me the question whether developed countries are following this. So here's an example. So they wanted to, Australia is a continent that goes through periods of drought and periods of flooding. And so water is a commodity that can be very, very precious, or it can be the bane of your life. So in this, and particularly at that time, we were going through a period of drought. So water was a very important issue. And so the Lochiel Park developers were very, very conscious of ensuring that they were able to bring in water back onto the site and maintain water on the site. So that was part of the planning and the development process. They wanted to use wherever possible conventional building materials and taking into account obviously conventional building design. So that cookie cutter approach that I talked about, that is what a lot of our volume builders in Australia do. So it doesn't matter where the northern axis is in Australia. It's because southern hemisphere, we want the northern sun. That's very important for us, unlike the northern hemisphere where you're looking for the southern sun or avoiding the southern sun, as the case may be. So it doesn't matter how the site is shaped. If there's a particular design, and this is what happens, mom and dads, when they want to go and buy a house, they will go to a particular volume builder. 90% of the population, they don't go to architects, because architects are very expensive. So they go to these volume builders, and these volume builders will have a catalog of different plans. And then you go through the catalog, and then you select the plan, and each one will have some very nice names, like it might be King Alfred, or it might be Queen Anne, or whatever, very, very sexy names to seduce buyers to buy them. Nobody thinks about it, and the common man doesn't know anything about orientation. So they're not going to be looking for orientation when all they're interested in, and somebody mentioned this already, is how does the house look, right? That's all they're interested in. And if they've got a family, then the standard Australian wants a 4-bedroom home. Mom, dad, 2 kids want a 4-bedroom home. This is usually what happens with a formal area, with a family room, and so on. So the houses, traditional Australian houses, sit on a quarter-acre block with a bit of garden in the front, a bit of garden at the back, and gardening is very important to Australians. That's what a lot of them do on weekends. Very proud of their gardens. Particularly if they are flowering gardens, they're very proud. So usually flowering gardens are in the front, vegetable patches will tend to be at the back. And so they're not really concerned at the time of buying because most of them will go to a bank to get loan and pay the mortgage. Most of them are not really thinking about the cost of running the home. They're only thinking about what it is that they're paying. So remember I talked about what happens at the start and then the operational side of things once you occupy the building. So if a house is very large and open plans are very, very common, so often the kitchen, dining, family, room areas will be one big space. So if it is a very, very hot, and Adelaide can go up to 45 degrees in summer. So if it's very, very hot, you need to condition the space, and so you're going to need a fairly large area, large volume for conditioning. So if the orientation is not right, then you're totally stuffed as far as the bills are concerned, then you have to pay. So what Lockhill Park authorities decided was that they would have a design, it will be well laid out so that you can try and maximize northern access to the site wherever possible. The houses would not be very large compared to standard Australian houses, so try and keep the size of the rooms much smaller, so they're not very large. Try and promote natural passive design as much as possible, so natural shading, natural orientation, encourage food production, have a school on the site or close to the site so people are not having to travel long distances for kids to go to school, and then have a play area for the children so they're not having to leave that site to go for entertainment purposes somewhere else. So try and contain it all within the subdivision as much as possible. The other thing also was that the government authorities decided we have what is called as a star rating in Australia, and we go from 5 stars up to 10 stars. So NATAS stands for National House Energy Rating Scheme. This is mandated through the Building Construction Code. We have the National Construction Code in Australia, so we have plumbing regulations as well as building regulations, all as part of the National Construction Code. So they wanted to try and move the houses to 10 stars as much as possible. So typically a 10-star home would use no energy to heat and cool throughout the year. So when I say throughout the year, what it means is that there may be periods in winter time where they would need to use the energy for heating, but then they would supply energy back to the grid. So overall, on an annual basis, they wouldn't need energy to heat and cool. So local energy production on site. So here's an example of a typical 3-bedroom home, which has got ground and 1 level. And so here they use what is called as a reverse brick veneer. So brick veneer basically means that you have brick on the outside, and then you have plasterboard on the inside, and they're half bricks, so not the full brick width, so they're put lengthways, and then you have insulation in between. Now this is really good in climates when you want to have good thermal mass. But reverse brick veneer is when you have plaster on the outside, you have brick on the inside, and then you have insulation in between. So what that does, it actually keeps the indoor environment fairly consistent throughout the year. So that's why they use reverse brick veneer, because as I said, temperatures can go very cold in winter and it can go quite hot in summer. But summer typically is not very, is not like Walia, where I've been told 8 months of really hot weather. So summer maybe, is typically over a period of 3 months, and within that period of 3 months, usually you don't have too many hot days. But this is changing. Now, when I went to Australia about 30 years ago, the climate was, if you had a really hot day, a 42-degree day in Melbourne, then you would have storms, and so that it would cool down. But now that 40-degree, 42, 43, 45 sometimes can continue over a period of 2 or 3 or 4 days. And as a result, then the house becomes, there's no, that radiation of heat back at night time is contained. And because of urban heat island effect, it's really contained, and so it doesn't actually has the opportunity to cool down. So that's why reverse brick veneer actually works better sometimes than actual standard brick veneer. And there was a lot of insulation put into the wall, roof and floor to ensure that the house, is not subjected to the changes in the weather as it would be on the outside. They also use low E glazing, so that the window itself doesn't absorb sunlight, particularly in summertime. And a lot of double glazing was used. So again, that keeps the heat in during winter time. Here is another example of what is called as Josh's house. So I have to explain this to you a little bit. So Josh became a celebrity on the national broadcasting, ABC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation. We have got radio, ABC radio, we've got ABC television. And so he became committed towards sustainability, and he wanted to build a house. So the whole process of him building this house and monitoring his house became a television series. So Josh built his house in Perth. And there's a source that you can go in and have a look if you want to. So what Josh did in his house was, you can see on the left hand side with the blue column, the typical energy savings in kilowatt per year for a typical house in Perth is close to 9,000 kilowatts per year. And in Josh's house, he used solar panels, he used a solar hot water system, and he had a very efficient design. So he went to NATA's 10 rating, and then he used a natural light as much as possible, so he didn't need to use artificial lighting during the day. And he used LED fittings in his house, and then he used energy metering and other savings. So the typical energy use of Josh's house was about 1,000, or maybe even less than that. Whereas a standard Perth house was about 9,000 kilowatt hours per year. So you can see all the things that he did to his house, and as I said, there was a series, and the same thing he did with water. So typical water use in Perth was over 100 liters per person and per annum in terms of kiloliters. And then he used water efficiency measures, he did rainwater harvesting, he used grey water. So grey water is a water that it comes out of your wash basin and your laundry and your shower. That's all grey water, and as well as your kitchen. And then what is black water is water that's used in the toilet. So he reused grey water. So water that came out of his laundry and out of his kitchen was either used for gardening, or it was used back into toilet flushing. And so the personal water use in Josh's house, Josh, his wife and his kids, that was about 40. And then in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, again you can see the carbon footprint of a normal Australian house is roughly 3.5, so maybe 3.8, 3.75 tons carbon dioxide equivalent per occupant per person per year. Because he sourced materials locally, his embodied energy, and therefore embodied carbon was quite low. The amount that he saved, he also was able to save through the use of solar panels and the final footprint, carbon footprint of Josh's house. So basically energy has been converted into carbon dioxide equivalent. And then here is of a typical Perth home and Josh's home. So this was in terms of the cost comparison. So he was able to make a clear case that even though his house was non-traditional, it didn't actually cost more because he was able to use locally sourced materials. So a typical Perth home was about $425,000, whereas his home was a little less than $375,000. So here's a clear business case for him. So there are other Australian examples that I would like you to have a look at. The Aussie zero energy home that's in Melbourne. There's one in Sydney, which is being supported by CSR, which is one of the insulation manufacturers. There's also an innovation house in Townsville. Townsville is a tropical climate, so quite hot throughout the year. And there's also one in Pilbara, which is in the mining community. So as I said before, a typical 10-star NATA's house is not supposed to use energy for heating and cooling. And therefore, the key message that I want to give you is that you really need to think about planning. And you need to think about the operation. So you really need to be very concrete And this is where the monitoring for your goals become very important. Try and have your design what we call as passive design. So you make the best use of vernacular architecture or bioclimatic architecture for that space wherever possible. Measure and report the actual performance, because that's the only way you're going to know where you've gone wrong. There's nothing wrong in going wrong. You learn from that exercise and you pick yourself up and move on and try and get it right at the end of the day. And wherever possible, try and have energy generation on site. I also want to show you this project called Nightingale, which is a fairly recent project where one of my colleagues was involved in. Housing affordability is a huge issue in Australia. And the price of housing has increased so much particularly over the last 10 years, that a lot of young people who are earning money are just not able to get into the housing market at all, because on an average the cost of house should be about 3 times a person's salary, right? So the average salary in Australia is about $60,000. So 3 times that should be $180,000. So say $200,000 should be the standard cost of a home. Now you saw already in Josh's house, which he built, where are we, 2018. So he would have built his house about at least 6 years ago, maybe even earlier than that. And it was already about $400,000, say about $380,000. So even 6 years ago, and Perth is much cheaper in terms of housing compared to Sydney and Melbourne. So now a typical average home in Melbourne, and if you're looking, when I say an average home, I'm not talking about a flat, I'm talking about a 3 or 4 bedroom house, is going to cost you, if you're looking at within the inner suburbs, so about say 10 kilometers from the central business district, you're looking at about $1 million, $1.5 million. That is clearly unaffordable for somebody who's on a $60,000 salary. You get cheaper houses that are far away from the city. So 50, 55 kilometers from the city in the new growth suburbs, you'll find housing for about $500,000. But again, that is still way above 3 times an average salary. So the point that I'm making is clearly housing is becoming unaffordable. And rentals are therefore people who own homes and who rent out homes are raking it in. And this is bringing inequity in the marketplace. So there's government intervention to try and build low-cost housing wherever possible. So this is an example of one of those where my colleague, people are buying now equity into housing units. So people are now moving away from having this standard average quarter acre Australian block and having one house in it. So moving away from the bungalow type, what we call in India bungalow type of arrangement, more and more into flats and medium density, and particularly in areas around the city, because most people tend to travel into the central business district. Most people, not all, most people tend to travel into central business district because that's where the service industries are. We have 2 major universities that are very close. RMIT is right in the CBD. Victoria University has a large part of the central business district. Melbourne University is about 2.5 kilometers from one end of the central business district. So and then of course there are shopping areas, and there are offices, there are banks, and what you would typically expect to find in central business district. So this government intervention, and government is now beginning to support. So the response of some people has been to bring equity. So bring equity into your property. So a standard title would be again on a quarter acre block or on a flat would be the title, the ownership of that flat or that property would belong to the people who have paid money for it, essentially. That's how it works in other parts of the world. But in the Nightingale model, everyone who is owning the houses there, they have an equity for everything in that space, everything in that property. So you own your flat, yes, but you also own everything else. So it becomes a shared arrangement. And it is a new arrangement that is being now touted, because that way, when everybody becomes the owner, you have a better say in terms of shaping the design, and in terms of shaping the services, and in terms of shaping what people want within that. And I'll highlight some of those what you would expect in a standard Australian home, which you will not find in a Nightingale residence. So Brunswick is about 5-6 kilometers from the central business district. When I went to Australia 20 years ago, you could buy a house in Brunswick, and Brunswick is a fairly older suburb. 30 years ago, you could buy a house in Brunswick for $30,000. Now, if you want to buy a standard 3-bedroom, even if it's a weatherboard renovated home, you would be paying about $1.5 million. Okay? So as I said again, the message, clearly unaffordable. So where Nightingale has been, the site for Nightingale is across, very close to the railway line. Now, I'm sure it's the case in India as well. Railway lines or properties around railway lines, or very close to railway lines, are not very sexy properties because of the noise of the train that passes through. And so they're not really, in terms of location, not really that hot in terms of property. So this Nightingale development is about 30 meters from the railway line. There is another housing, and you can see on the first photo on the left-hand side, you can see that there's another housing there, which is built, called the Commons, which is also built on similar principles. And you can see that they have a lot of greenery. Now that is a west-facing wall, and west-facing walls get very, very hot in summer. So you can see that, and Commons is not very old, Commons is only about 2 years old. So you can see that the lower part of where they have got the greenery is now beginning to take shape, and I'll show you another photo in which you can see on the higher walls, on the higher levels, you can see the greenery has expanded. So the idea of putting greenery on the walls, can anybody tell me why would you bother putting greenery on the walls? What is the intent? Sort of, you're getting warm, but I'm looking for another answer. Yes, that's the reason why, which in turn has an impact on the energy use. So if you're able to keep that wall cool and not let the wall absorb, and you can see it's a brick, it is a brick wall. You may not be able to see very clearly because of all the graffiti. But if you're able to keep that wall cool, particularly in summertime, and so a lot of the creepers that we use are those that will fall in winter. So in winter time, the wall will be without the greenery, so they're all deciduous, in other words. So the wall will be without, so you can absorb that sun in winter time because it's a very low angle sun, you need that. And that will be re-radiated back into the rooms, and therefore you don't need to use as much energy to heat the space. Whereas in summertime, you don't want that western sun because the western sun is very harsh, and so if you have greenery, and we went there, so we are moving into autumn now. So we were there in February, middle February. So officially from the 1st of March we have moved into autumn, and the weather is still reasonably warm. It hasn't started becoming cold yet. So that's us walking. There was a bunch of us that went, and on the right hand side you can see us walking from our meeting point to see Nightingale. So that's another photo of the Commons with the graffiti and the greenery, and you can see there's some trees in the front as well, and you can see of the sidewalk, a large area of the sidewalk or footpath I should say, in the Indian context, has not all been paved. So part of it has been paved and part of it has deliberately been made green, so that again you can try and reduce that heat island effect, and you can try and supplement the water tables. On the right hand side we're standing right in front of the Nightingale, the building. So you can see it's not a very tall building, it's only a few stories high. It does have a lift, but most people tend to use the stairs, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And in front, so this site here, I don't have a pointer, do I? So the site here, this lower site here, that is going to be demolished, and there's going to be a new building that's coming up. and that doesn't belong. It's a private investment, so it doesn't belong to the Nightingale. And at the base of this building is a coffee shop. On one side is a coffee shop, and the coffee shop actually trains people who have finished up until year 10. So people who are wanting to break into the workforce, so like baristas, people who make coffee. So it's to give those people opportunities to learn skills and then to release them. So this is through a government program where they're supporting young people to get jobs. So so likewise with coffee, but also for food, preparing meals in the kitchen, etc. So that is a social enterprise, and so that is being supported. So Nightingale deliberately said that we will have this space available for this form of social enterprise. So this is the commons, the green wall that I talked about, the west facing. So that's the commons, and you can see the commons, which is another project very similar, and back opposite Nightingale has got quite a lot of greenery going all the way up. So that is west, east. So that's a northern end. So that is actually how it is in summer. So it's actually able to control some of that harsh northern light that comes into the building. And here so this is on the side of the coffee shop. You can see the coffee machine there, and somebody sitting there doing some work and having this coffee. So this is somebody who's just walked up from the street, and this is right in front of the Nightingale. Now you'll notice on the left-hand side photo that there's lots of exposed pipes, and this was deliberately done. So on the side here, just before all these pipes are all the meters of all the individual units that are there. So the water meter, the energy meters are all there, and all these different pipes, which are basically service pipes for different things in the building, has deliberately not been hidden. So they said, why put it at the back? Why waste materials? Why waste that space? So we will have it open, and we'll have it hidden, and for them, for the owners of Nightingale, this was part of the aesthetics. On the right hand side you can see photos. So there's no car parking on site. So most apartment buildings in Australia would have at least one car park per flat, sometimes more. In this instance, no car parking at all on the site. So if they have a car, the owners have a car, they have to park that out on the street, and they have to pay extra money to the council to park their car out on the street. And so the whole place, which you can see in the next photo, is filled with bikes. So on the left hand side you can see that's a basement, and you can see there are more pipes exposed. And that whole area is just filled with bicycles. On the right hand side, I don't think you can see this very well, but on the right hand side where we're all standing and we're talking, there's a storage unit that each unit has, and the storage unit is about roughly 12 meter cube in volume. So it's not very large storage areas, but because each of the flats don't have a lot of storage space. And I can't show you photos of the flat because when we walked into one of the flats, it was, somebody was living there and they didn't want us taking photos of it, but I'll explain what is in that particular flat. And they're small flats, this one was about 60 square meters. And then on the bottom side you can see
the ITF will have
okay, that's okay. If you have a class, you can go. And I'll try and be a bit quick so we can wrap this up quickly. And then on the bottom side you can see the stairs. So you probably can't see this very well, but this is a central staircase, which is these are the stairs. This is a railing, and rather than completely segregating the stairs from this open well here, they have purposely put mesh. So that two reasons: one, they can get light. Safety barrier, of course, that goes without saying. But the third reason was to promote cross ventilation because it's open to sky. So again, you can see in the corridor leading up to the flats, there are pipes exposed. So again, this is not hidden. Lots of use of right sort of materials. So there's a lot of timber used and obviously This is not from, they're FSC certified. So forest stewardship certified timber being used, which comes from plantation rather than destruction of old forests. On the right-hand side top photo was when we were going into one of the flats. So the flat was, there was a combination of 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom flats. They didn't have any 3-bedroom flats at all. And therefore, the people that were owning flats here were either young professionals, maybe single or maybe couple. There were not many families with young kids. Now, typically in Australia, you would have a bedroom per child. So the people that lived, I think there were 4 families with young kids that were less than 2 years old, so they were reasonably happy living in that, that sort of, again, what is the expectation that people would have? They were pretty happy living there. Each of the rooms, they had wall-to-ceiling storage. So they tried to maximize the amount of space within the rooms by having this wall-to-ceiling storage. The kitchen bench top was just concrete. It was just concrete, no paint, no nothing. So concrete, you have the sink, you have the stove, and the rest of the bench top was just concrete. The wall behind was concrete. And so there was a lot of clever design in terms of using the spaces. The flat that we saw also had a balcony. So that particular flat had a lot of greenery in that balcony. And low VOC paints and a whole range of other things that we used. The bathroom didn't have any tiles, so it was all exposed concrete because they didn't want to put things again on top. So it was waterproofed, and that was it. So it was very stark in terms of, so reminded me quite a bit about Corbusier's approach to his architecture as well. And then on the bottom, you can see the terrace, and so they have a usable terrace. There's a lot of greenery in the terrace, and within the terrace, there were little pockets, areas where people could congregate. If they wanted to, they could all be together as a community. But if they didn't want to, they could have their own little niche areas. There was a sandpit. There was an area for kids to play on the terrace. So that's the staircase you can see going down with that wire mesh. The other interesting thing was that none of the flats had, typically you tend to have laundry units in the flat. So here the laundry unit was actually kept up on the terrace. So there were about eight laundry units that people could use, and there were absolutely no dryers. Now you actually do need to have dryers if you've got young kids, because otherwise things will not dry when it's cold in winter. So the drying area was under cover, and there was enough space for people to dry. And it was interesting when we spoke to the building manager, who also lives there. He was saying that sometimes people need to get used to living in a communal setting, because people will put things out to dry, and particularly if you've done your laundry washing, you've washed your sheets and things like that, you've occupied quite a few of the drying space, and then if you forget to pick it up and somebody comes in and they don't have enough space for drying. So those sort of things needed to be worked out. So some form of behavioral etiquette needed to be worked out. The other thing was also what sort of plantings would they put, and when we went there, it was between seasons, so the summer had ended, so they had to decide what they wanted to do. They had some herbs, and again, it was who's going to look after it. So it's nice when you want to go and pick up some mint, or you want to pick up some dill, for cooking, but then who's going to look after it? So those were some of the behavioral things that needed to be nutted out. So you can see on the right hand side on top, you can see the commons, the one that was opposite. You can see a full view of that, and this was on the other side, the northern part of the terrace. So these were the beds, that needed. They had to decide what they were going to use for planting in these beds on the roof. So just very quickly, I'll go through this. As I said to you before, one of the things that I was particularly interested in from our own university was to examine a building that had won a number of awards, but to see how that building actually performed. So we undertook a post-occupancy evaluation. And so post-occupancy evaluation, a number of different definitions for it. But for me, simply it is closing the feedback loop. What was your original intent when you designed the building, and what have you achieved? And have you achieved it? Have you not achieved it? What are the gaps? What can we learn from the gaps? And how can we get better over a period of time? I won't talk about all this. This is important because the university had a vision and a mission to incorporate sustainability, and this was, going back to, we have got a different strategic plan now, but built on this one. And this strategic plan then, from 2011 to 2015, focused on reach and impact. Impact was an important part of the university's vision and mission. So I then made an argument to say, well, if RMIT is going to be building a number of these innovative new buildings, then if they are going to be demonstrating sustainability outcomes, so then we need to show that they're demonstrating sustainability outcomes. We can't just be standing and talking in a class, talking to our students about sustainability and not showing them examples of sustainability in practice. So that was the main idea. In addition to that, there were other commitments that the university made, 25% reduction based on 2007 levels by 2020, which we've already achieved, by the way. Proud to say. Also made a commitment to purchase 20% university's electricity from green power, which is going to cost more for the university, but then with the savings that we make to our buildings, it's in terms of the return on investment is a good opportunity that has presented itself. And then we also set up a sustainability committee for the first time in the university. So the building I'm going to talk about is called SAB, or the Swanson Academic Building, and here are the details of the building. It's $182 million in terms of its cost. It's got 12 levels, 12 above ground, 2 below ground, 35,000 square meters of learning and teaching facility for 6,000 students, 850 staff, all from the business school. So we have got a College of Business and about 4 or 5 schools within that College of Business, and the building was built for the College of Business. And so this was the brief, that we wanted to engage future generation of teaching, learning, and engage with our students. That's why we wanted to create a vertical campus, because we were in the CBD, we didn't have a lot of horizontal space, so that's why we decided to go vertically. And we wanted to achieve a 5-star education design. So this is like the equivalent of Griha, but in the Australian context. It's got that star rating. 5-star represents Australian best practice. And 6-star represents leadership in the world. So it's world best practice. So this was not a 6-star, but it was a 5-star, but it was based only on design, only from the design intent. And using a design and construct guaranteed maximum price contract rather than a standard design and build. So standard design and build is where the architect will design, a builder comes and build. So the engagement between the architect and builder does not take place in a standard design and build. But in this instance, with the design and construct, everybody had a vested interest, because everybody was responsible for each other's liabilities as well as success. The building was completed 108 days ahead of schedule. A lot of innovative IT things were undertaken in this building, as well as design and materials. These are the number of different awards it won. It doesn't matter. Now, what was the aim in undertaking the research? The aim was, has this building, the building has been set up to be a 5-star green star design. Has it achieved it? What are the aspirational outcomes, and have we been able to achieve it? So we used a case study methodology, and it was a mixed method. So we used quantitative data as well as qualitative data. So in terms of the quantitative data, we measured the building. We also had a building monitoring system, so we cross-checked that. We actually also put physiological measurements, so we put hobos, and we looked at lighting, we looked at the temperatures, a whole range of different things, relative humidity, all of that. And then we also looked at the how people felt in the building. So we used what is called as a bus survey, a building user survey, and we also undertook an interview with the project team, because we wanted to know what they were thinking and whether they felt the building was successful from their perspective or not. So we took these semi-structured interviews with 17 different people, you know, the architect, the project manager, etc., etc. And with the building user survey, we did not use students, so we did not engage with 6,000 students for a number of different reasons, which I won't go into. But we thought that we would look at the permanent users of the building, which is the staff and higher degree by research students, because they're usually there. They're meant to be there only for 3 years, but they usually stay there for 5 years. And then we initially sent out soft copies to people, but we found that the responses was very poor. So we then gave them hard copies. So we had about a fifth in terms of the response rate. We also looked at the utility data. So what was the energy spent? What was the water use in the building? What is the gas use in the building? And then so we then triangulated. So the BMS data, our own data, utility data, and then we also spoke to property services. So this is a comparison of the actual and the predicted or the targeted energy performance. So you've got energy in kilowatt per meter square. So on the left hand side, the first column is the actual performance of the building. So this is normalized over the entire year, summer, winter period, as well as over weekends. The second column is the average comparable RMIT building on the city campus. So this is on the city campus. So we looked at what is the typical energy use of a standard building. And then the green star target, which is what the design set out to do. So you can see quite clearly we did not achieve the design target. We also looked at the actual energy performance target. So what RMIT wanted was to actually go lower than what was set out by Green Star. So Green Star has roughly about 63 kilowatts per meter square, and RMIT said no, we need to go even lower than that. Let's see if we can try and achieve it. But did we achieve it? No. Quite clearly we did not achieve it. However, this building performed better than other buildings on campus. So let's now take a little bit of a deep dive to see why. This is the results of the bus survey. So it's usually, there's a number of different questions, but they are categorized over some categories such as temperature, comfort, design, health, image to visitors, lighting, etc., etc. And green means it's done really well compared to a number of other buildings. It goes into a database and there's a benchmark that's done. So that's how you get the green, the red and the amber scores. So green means the building is doing quite well. So the building did well in terms of design and in terms of image to visitors. The amber means it's not that bad. So you can see in terms of amber, the building was okay in terms of the summer and winter temperatures, the overall comfort, the overall lighting, the needs of the building users, so whether those needs were actually met in terms of their own perception, self-reporting, their productivity. But the building did not do well in terms of overall noise and in terms of perceived health. And the reason this was largely because when staff and HDR students moved into this building, they moved from single offices into open plans. And as a result of the open plans, there's greater ambient noise in the space, so they were obviously affected by that. And they also felt that if somebody has got a cold or somebody was sneezing, then they were taking in those germs. So that's why in these two areas the building did not do so well at all. We also did a carbon buzz thing, which is a UK concept, carbon buzz, where they benchmark different buildings. And so it's run entirely by and set within the context of UK, so it's for UK buildings. So we wanted to see how our building did in the context of carbon buzz, and you can see that if you compare it with other UK buildings, looking at it from the Australian context, it was more towards the right-hand side of this graphic. But if you put that into the UK climate, where all the other buildings are in the UK climate, so if you transpose that into the UK climate, it actually didn't do too bad. Then we also looked at what is the occupancy of the building and what is the energy intensity from an per occupant perspective. And you can see that the building, the sub-occupant, actually has got a very low energy intensity compared to the average across the campus. And this is because the building is really used by students. Anytime you go in that building, day or night, weekends, anytime, particularly towards exam time, building is a hive of activity. So and this was an area that was totally underestimated. So the assumptions that were built into the use of this building far exceeded in terms of its occupancy. We also looked at the annual energy intensity per occupant. This is across all the RMIT buildings that are on campus. And you can see on the right hand side, we've got the buildings that were built in the 70s and 80s. So with no consideration at all to energy efficiency. And the Saab building, which is building 80 on the extreme left hand side, has done really well in comparison. So in terms of water consumption, it had 61% lower water consumption compared to other RMIT buildings, but still not meeting its Green Star target. From a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, it was 3.5 times higher than the predicted rate. So as you saw, the energy was not what was either in terms of its design intent or even what it was as far as Green Star was concerned. I've already talked about the bus survey, so some areas were good, some areas not so good. In terms of the satisfaction levels of the building, compared to other buildings in the Australian benchmark, it was at the 64th percentile. So it didn't do too bad, but it wasn't really that great. From a management perspective, lots of little things that happened in the building that needed to be fine-tuned over a period of time. So clearly, we did not meet the design intent of the building. From the interviews, what did we find? We found that one of the main reasons why the building and the support that the building got was because there was support from the Vice Chancellor at that time from the university. So the Vice Chancellor was really committed to sustainability. So the Vice Chancellor made sure that in terms of the design of the building, in terms of all the sustainability benchmarks that we try to achieve in the building, that support came from the Vice Chancellor. So the top-down support is very important. At the same time, it is very important to be very transparent about what are these design criteria that we're trying to measure, what are these outputs that we're trying to measure. The whole, because of the guaranteed, the way the contract was structured with the guaranteed maximum price contract, the architects, the engineers, the consultants, the project managers, all were part of the one team, because as I said before, they shared the success, but they also shared the liability. So the ownership of the ensuring that the design was well done, the documentation was well done, the construction of the building was well done, actually supported the building to be completed 108 days ahead of schedule. So that ownership and that relationship that was built was very, very integral. The fact that we did not look at performance right at the start, and we had some very unrealistic ideas about making it even lower than Green Star, was obviously not achievable. So this is something to think about, and therefore a performance intent should really should have been built in from the start. So the disconnect between the actual performance of the building and the design performance is a very important gap that needs to be addressed. So this was some of the, I won't read them out, but just for you to look at, what did some of the stakeholders that we interviewed, what were some of the things that they said? So they said, for example, that because it was a new approach to designing teaching and learning spaces, there's some spaces that did not work very well. So for example, there's one area for used for tutorials where bean bags were used. You know what bean bags are, right? So they found that while the bean bags are great for sitting down and having a cup of tea and sitting in front of a television, they're not really good when you have your iPad and you're trying to type things. So that space did not work very well. So they had to get the bean bags out and bring in tables and chairs. As I said before, it had significantly higher occupation than predicted. So, and also in terms of the uses of the building, it performed above average in terms of its design and its image. It's a very funky building, and if you're ever in Melbourne, it's right next to Melbourne Central Station. Just 50 meters, you must walk down and have a look at the building. And you saw the photos that I've shown you throughout this presentation with its very funky facade. But of course, it did not perform well in all the categories. So this is how the building looks from the Swanston Street entrance. And the facade was deliberately designed in this way to ensure that light comes into the building, but you can keep the sun out. So it was designed as a shading device. And in fact, the architects had built a scale model of one floor, which they had in their offices, to test it. It's very important that before you roll it out to the rest of the building, you test it. So that relationship that was built between the architect and the engineers and the project managers was a very, very important one. And to me, that was fundamental to the success of this building. The main reason why the building was completed ahead of schedule and more. And these are some photos of the inside spaces within the buildings. Again, as you can see, even the interior was quite funky looking. Okay, so I'll skip over the conclusions. But I want to talk about this because I think this is really important for you. So when you're thinking, and if you are learning already about sustainability, I want you to move away from just learning about it to practicing it. So I want you to move away from learning about sustainability to learning for sustainability. So all the things on the left-hand side that I've got there, those are all things that we say we're going to do, but we don't actually act. The things on the right-hand side are what you should be doing. So if you're just talking about passing on knowledge and raising awareness, you need to convert that into practice. So move it to understanding and getting to the root of issues. Move away from teaching just about attitudes and values, just sort of espousing them to actually encouraging values. So show that in what you do. Seeing people as a problem to seeing people as agents of change. And we talked about how can you try and bring your clients in. So don't see them as being a problem, but they could, if you convince them and you work with them, they can actually be your agents of change. And they can support you in your own cause. So moving from single actions, think holistically and think about how you can continue to build and learn for change. Move the focus on individual and personal change to structural and institutional change. And some of these things take a very long time. My own personal quest at the university took me 5 years. 5 years of speaking to various people across the university to say, we've got this building, we're building this building, it is setting up benchmarks in terms of what university buildings ought to be. We must measure it. And getting that funding to do that, to measure the building, took me a very long time. But I was persistent. From integration, just integrating into innovating. So think outside the box. Think about solutions that you can try and discover and uncover. Move it from purely problem-solving approaches to creating alternative futures. And where people are involved, people become the backbone of those futures. And rather than just sending simply messages, which is a very linear way, it's just from one to the other in a very didactic format, start creating opportunities for reflection, negotiation, and participation. And this is my key message to you. So take this as an opportunity for where you can make change. Because for us to be sustainable, it cannot just be a few countries or a few people. We have to be in this together. And with that, I'll end. So any questions? I know it's time for lunch. Oh my God. I didn't realize that I took so long. Apologies. You should have stopped me. So are there any questions? Anjali?
Yeah. Initially, last 2 weeks, we had this sustainability session as a course, a GAN course, which we faculty from various departments of a college were attending. I just thought of this talk will be very beneficial for you people if you get sensitized a little bit and practice it into your profession as an architect and take this sustainability with you. And we are planning to have few more projects about sensitizing, maybe for schools or even within the institute we may take those projects. So that will take up, and I hope we'll make it.
I'm sure you will. I mean, you've got all your other faculty behind you, so I'm sure you will.
And thank you so much.
I'm sorry I've eaten into your lunchtime, but somebody should have reminded me that I'm just going on for too long. I had no idea. So my apologies for that.
And thank you for giving me a holiday.
Somebody's going to switch all this off?
Yeah, and one.